Story number 1. The Locker That Whispers. Cedar Ridge High had over 1,000 lockers, but everyone knew to stay away from locker 329. It sat at the end of a dimly lit hallway on the second floor, its metal door covered in faint scratches and dents. Rumor had it the locker belonged to a girl named Valerie, a sophomore who went missing decades ago. Nobody knew the full story, but the whispers claimed one thing: Valerie was still there, trapped. And if you listened closely, you could hear her whispering for help. Mia didn't believe in ghosts. She was new to Cedar Ridge and wasn't about to buy into stupid school legends. But when she was assigned Locker 328, right next to the infamous 329, she couldn't help but feel uneasy. On her first day, as she placed her books inside, she glanced at the scratched-up locker. It looked wrong. The scratches weren't random. They formed patterns, almost like words written in a language she didn't understand. "Don't stare at it," warned Dylan, the boy whose locker was on the other side. "Why not?" "It doesn't like being noticed." Mia rolled her eyes. "It's just a locker." Dylan sighed. "Suit yourself, just don't touch it." That afternoon, Mia stayed late to finish an English assignment in the library. By the time she headed back to her locker, the hallway was empty, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above. As she packed her bag, she heard it, a faint whisper. Mia froze, her eyes darting to locker 329. The sound came again, soft and pleading. "Help me." Her heart raced, but she forced a laugh. "Great, my locker's haunted," she muttered, slamming her door shut. "Please." The voice came again, louder this time. Mia turned to leave, but the air around her felt heavier, colder. She couldn't help herself. She stepped closer to locker 329. "Is someone in there?" she whispered. The whispering stopped. Against her better judgment, Mia reached out and touched the cold metal door. The world seemed to shift. The hallway darkened, and the faint hum of the lights vanished, replaced by an eerie silence. And then, the locker door swung open. Mia stumbled back, staring into the darkness inside. It wasn't like a normal locker. There were no shelves, no hooks, no back wall, just a void, endless and consuming. And in the depths of that darkness, two eyes stared back at her. "Help me," the voice said again, this time louder, clearer. It sounded like a girl. "Valerie?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. The eyes blinked and a pale skeletal hand reached out from the void, its fingers curling around the edge of the locker. "Take my hand," the voice pleaded. "Please." Mia's instincts screamed at her to run, but she was rooted to the spot. "Are you trapped in there?" she asked. "Yes," the voice said, trembling with desperation. "Please, I need your help. Just pull me out." Mia hesitated. The hand didn't look right. Its fingers were too long. Its skin stretched too tight over the bones. "I don't think—" "Help me!" the voice screamed, suddenly sharp and angry. The hand shot out, grabbing Mia's wrist. She yelped, trying to pull away, but its grip was ice cold and impossibly strong. The darkness in the locker swirled, pulling at her like a vortex. "Let go," she screamed, clawing at the locker door with her free hand. The thing inside laughed then, its voice deep and hollow. "You can't leave," it hissed. "You opened the door." Mia kicked and screamed as the vortex pulled her closer, her vision blurred, her body growing weaker as the darkness consumed her. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Mia blinked, gasping for air. She was lying on the floor of the hallway, the locker door shut tight. Her wrist throbbed where the hand had grabbed her, and when she looked, she saw dark, finger-shaped bruises. She scrambled to her feet, backing away from locker 329, but the whispers weren't gone. "Help me," the voice murmured, softer now, almost mocking. The next day, Mia tried to report what happened, but no one believed her. "Kids pull pranks with that locker all the time," the principal said dismissively. But Mia knew what she saw, and she wasn't the only one. During lunch, Dylan cornered her by the lockers. "You heard it, didn't you?" he asked. Mia nodded. "You're marked now," he said quietly, glancing nervously at locker 329. "It won't stop calling you." "What do you mean?" Dylan's face was pale. "Once you hear it, it never leaves you alone. Just don't listen, no matter what." That night, Mia lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her house was silent, but in the distance she could hear it, faint, persistent. "Help me." And it was getting closer. Story number 2, The Substitute. It started when Mrs. Harper, the beloved history teacher, suddenly fell ill. Emergency appendectomy, the principal had announced at assembly, trying to sound reassuring. She'll be out for a while, but we've found an excellent substitute. The substitute arrived the next morning. Mr. Greaves was tall and thin, with sharp features and cold, pale eyes. His suit was outdated, faded gray with a tie that looked like it came from another century. When he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes, and the room seemed colder when he entered. But his teaching was captivating. He spoke about history as though he'd lived it, describing battles, revolutions, and ancient rituals with vivid detail. Students hung on his every word, even as unease crept through the classroom. No one could explain it, but sitting in Mr. Greaves' class felt wrong. Samantha noticed it first. "Have you seen how he never eats or drinks?" she whispered to her friend Jake as they walked to lunch. "Not once. He just stares at us while we're working, like he's studying us." Jake shrugged. "He's probably just weird. Lots of teachers are." But Samantha couldn't shake the feeling. That afternoon, she stayed late after class to grab her notebook. She was sure she'd left it on her desk, but when she walked in, the room was empty, except for Mr. Greaves. He stood at the chalkboard, muttering in a language she didn't recognize. His hands moved in sharp, deliberate gestures, and the air around him seemed to ripple. Mr. Greaves," she said hesitantly. He turned sharply, his pale eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, the edges of his face seemed to blur, like smoke curling in the air. "You should go home, Samantha," he said, his voice low and cold. She didn't need to be told twice. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. Students who sat closest to Mr. Greaves during class complained of headaches and nausea. The fluorescent lights flickered constantly, casting odd shadows on the walls. And then there were the missing students. It started with Daniel, who didn't show up for school one day. Then Emma. Then Luis. "They're probably just skipping," Jake said, but even he sounded unsure. Samantha wasn't convinced. She'd seen Daniel leave Mr. Greaves' classroom late one afternoon, his face pale and blank, like he wasn't entirely there. The next day, he was gone. Determined to figure out what was happening, Samantha convinced Jake to help her stay after school. "We'll just check his classroom," she said. "See if there's anything weird." Jake hesitated, but finally agreed. That evening, they snuck into the history wing, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. When they reached the door to Mr. Greaves' classroom, it was unlocked. Inside, the room was dark, except for the faint glow of candlelight. At the front of the class, Mr. Greaves stood over an old, battered book, his voice a low, guttural chant. In the center of the room was a strange symbol drawn in chalk, surrounded by flickering candles. And lying in the middle of the symbol was Emma. "What the hell?" Jake whispered, but Samantha clapped a hand over his mouth. They watched as Mr. Greaves raised his hands, the air around him shimmering. Emma's body began to levitate, her eyes wide open but unseeing. "I offer this one as payment," Mr. Greaves intoned, his voice echoing unnaturally. "The pact shall be fulfilled." Samantha's heart raced. She grabbed Jake's arm, motioning for him to follow her, but he froze. The floor beneath them creaked. Mr. Greaves' head snapped toward them, his eyes gleaming in the candlelight. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed, his voice distorting, deeper and inhuman. The candles flared, and the room seemed to warp, the walls stretching and bending. "Run!" Samantha screamed, yanking Jake toward the door. They bolted down the hallway, the sound of Mr. Greaves' footsteps echoing behind them. When they reached the front doors, they found them locked. Every exit, every window was sealed shut. A chilling laugh echoed through the halls. "You can't leave," Mr. Greaves' voice boomed, seeming to come from everywhere. "You're part of this now." The lights flickered, and shadows began to stretch and writhe along the walls, forming clawed hands that reached for them. Samantha grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall, smashing it through the nearest window. "Go!" she yelled, pushing Jake through. As she climbed out after him, she glanced back. Mr. Greaves stood at the end of the hallway, his face no longer human. His skin was cracked and gray, his mouth filled with sharp, glistening teeth. "This isn't over," he growled, his voice echoing unnaturally. The next morning, Mr. Greaves was gone. The principal announced that Mrs. Harper had miraculously recovered and would be returning to teach. But Samantha and Jake couldn't shake the memory of what they'd seen. Later that week, Samantha found an old yearbook in the library. Flipping through the pages, she stopped at a grainy black and white photo of a teacher in the 1950s. The caption read, "Mr. Greaves, History." The photo showed the same pale eyes, the same cold smile, and the note beneath it chilled her to the bone. Missing since 1957, presumed dead. Story number 3, The Janitor's Closet. The janitor's closet at Westfield Middle School was nothing special, just a small, cramped space filled with cleaning supplies. But for some reason, no one ever saw the janitor go in or out. His name was Mr. Anders, and he'd been working at the school for longer than anyone could remember. His face was lined and weathered, his eyes tired but sharp. He rarely spoke, but he always seemed to be watching. "Don't ever go near the closet," he'd mutter to kids he caught lingering in the hallway. "Stay away from it." One rainy afternoon, Sam and his friends were stuck at school, waiting for their parents to pick them up. The power had gone out, and most of the teachers had already left. "Let's check out the closet," Brian said, grinning. Sam hesitated. Mr. Anders said not to. "Oh, come on, what's the worst that could happen?" Brian said, already heading down the hall. Sam and their friend Jesse reluctantly followed. The closet was tucked away near the gym, a plain wooden door with a brass handle. Brian reached for the knob. "Don't," Jessie whispered, her voice shaky, but it was too late. The door creaked open, revealing a space that didn't make sense. It wasn't the small, cluttered room they expected. Instead, it stretched on endlessly, the walls lined with rows of shelves filled with things. Old broken toys, tattered notebooks, photos of people they didn't recognize. "What is this?" Sam whispered, stepping inside. The air was cold and heavy, and the sound of their breathing seemed to echo unnaturally. Brian picked up a cracked porcelain doll from one of the shelves. Its eyes were missing, and its head lolled unnaturally to the side. Jessie shuddered. "This feels wrong. Let's go." But Brian wasn't listening. "Look at all this weird stuff," he said, running his hand along the shelves. Then from somewhere deep within the closet, they heard it. A whisper. "Who's there?" Sam called, his voice shaking. The whisper grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like a child crying. "Help me!" The three exchanged terrified looks. "We should leave," Jessie said, backing toward the door. But when she turned, the door was gone. "What the—" Jessie spun in a panic. "It was right here!" The walls around them seemed to shift and stretch, the shelves growing taller, the items on them rattling violently. The whisper turned into a chorus of voices, all overlapping, all pleading. "Help us! Find us! Don't leave us!" Brian dropped the doll and bolted deeper into the room. "Wait!" Sam yelled, chasing after him. The shelves seemed to go on forever, the air growing colder with every step. Jessie clung to Sam's arm, her breathing ragged. They found Brian standing at the center of the space, staring at something on the floor. It was a trapdoor, its edges outlined in glowing red light. "Don't open it," Jessie begged, tears streaming down her face. But Brian was already pulling at the handle. The trapdoor swung open with a deafening creak, revealing a pit of darkness, so deep it seemed to swallow the light around it. From the depths, a hand shot out. The hand was skeletal and covered in dark, decayed flesh. It grabbed Brian's ankle and yanked him toward the pit. "Help!" he screamed, clawing at the floor. Sam and Jessie lunged forward, grabbing his arms and pulling with all their strength. The voices from the shelves grew louder, screaming now, as more hands emerged from the pit, reaching for all of them. "Close it!" Jessie screamed, kicking at the hands. Sam managed to slam the trapdoor shut just as Brian was pulled free. The red light vanished, and the room fell silent. But the whispers returned, softer now, and more sinister. "Run!" The shelves around them began to collapse, the walls closing in. Sam spotted a faint outline of the door in the distance and screamed, "This way!" They ran, dodging falling shelves and clawed hands that reached out from the darkness. When they burst through the door, they collapsed in the hallway, gasping for air. Behind them, the closet door slammed shut with a final resounding boom. The next day, the closet was gone. In its place was a blank wall, as though it had never existed. Mr. Anders approached them during lunch, his eyes darker than they'd ever seen. "You went in, didn't you?" he asked quietly. Sam nodded, unable to meet his gaze. The old man sighed. "It's always hungry. Don't go near it again." "But it's gone," Jessie blurted out. Mr. Anders smiled grimly. "Not for long. It always comes back."